Good evening, everybody, and welcome.
Thank you for being here. My name is Emily Chamlee-Wright, and I'm the president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Institute for Humane Studies, or IHS for short, I just want to say a little bit about the work we do. Since 1961, IHS has been promoting debate and discussion of classical liberal ideas within the academy. Ideas like individual liberty, economic freedom, and the appropriate limits on government power. Classical liberal scholars tend to ask questions like, what are the rules of society that lead to widespread human flourishing? And with questions like that, who wouldn't be excited about classical liberal ideas, right? I mean, these were the ideas that got me excited as a student when I was at George Mason University many, many years ago. But those are also the sorts of questions that have sustained my intellectual curiosity and growth ever since. And that really gets to the how of IHS. You know, how is it that IHS champions classical liberal ideas? The main way we do that is by supporting the growing community of students and scholars who are interested in plumbing the depths of the classical liberal tradition and wrestling with the tensions and as yet unsolved question or unanswered questions within the classical liberal tradition. And that's really what IHS does. So speaking of that liberal tradition for a moment, one of the core principles is that human beings ought to have the right to pursue their life projects unencumbered and uncoerced from others, particularly from an overweening and intrusive state, right? And so from that starting point, the principle of freedom of speech follows directly from that. The right of people to engage freely in exchange of ideas without fear and intimidation tumble right out of that core principle. Our best ideas, the best ideas that we have, they need the bright lights of intellectual scrutiny and criticism so that they can get better, so that they can be improved. And just as importantly, the worst ideas we encounter in society also need the bright lights of intellectual scrutiny and criticism so that they can be weeded out. One of the other fundamental principles of the classical liberal tradition is that it's discourse. Slow discourse that is the best way for us to solve the differences amongst ourselves, right? And we know that discourse can be slow and aggravating, frustrating, sometimes even deeply upsetting, but it is far better than the alternative, which is either monolithic power or worse, violence, right? So this is then the context in which we enter into these conversations about free speech is that if you want a society that enjoys widespread human flourishing and lots and lots of peaceful social cooperation, then free speech and open inquiry are going to be necessary ingredients in that. But on college and university campuses in the contemporary context, we're really facing a fundamental existential challenge, right? With people challenging and doubting the very value of the free exchange of ideas. On college campuses now, we have those in the community who might be faculty, might be administrators, certainly students, who are doubting the value of free speech and open inquiry, especially if that rubs up against other concerns for social justice, for example, concerns about the well-being of students, the psychological well-being and emotional well-being of students, that in the throes of contentious and open debate, that these other concerns might get sacrificed. So this represents a real challenge to us, right? This questioning represents a real challenge to the classical liberal tradition, but it also represents a real opportunity. At least I believe that's the case, right? And at IHS, I think we believe that that's the case because it's an opportunity to articulate to a new generation the fundamental values of open inquiry to a liberal society more broadly. And it is an opportunity for us to lay the groundwork of what's necessary for achieving, maintaining, and yes, improving a free society. And in the course of our discussions, we are going to be talking a lot about the value of reason, right? And its critical role in a free society. I also want to talk about reason's fair companions, which include intellectual humility, respect for our intellectual counterparts on the other side of a debate, tolerance and civility. These are also liberal values that you'll be hearing more about from IHS in the months to come, about what are the makings of a really good conversation, a genuine conversation in which we're actually listening to and learning from one another. And so I'm delighted this evening to host what I know will be one of those conversations that will meet that standard. We have with us 4 scholars who are really at the forefront of free speech and open inquiry, who are pushing forward our understanding of the connection between free speech and what is necessary in the enterprise of achieving the liberal society. John Hasnas is to my left here. He is professor of business at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business and professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center. He's also the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics. And we have Todd Zywicki, also to his left, who is the George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. He is also a senior scholar of the Mercatus Center, our sister organization at George Mason University, and senior fellow at the Mercatus Center's F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And to his left, we have Nadine Strossen, who is the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law at New York Law School. In addition to that work she has been doing for a very long time as a faculty member, she was also the president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. What an incredible legacy she has left there. She has a forthcoming book titled Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press in May, and we can't wait. And to her left, we have Jonathan Rauch, who is a writer, a journalist, and senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. His 1993 book, Kindly Inquisitors, is a classic account of how open inquiry really is essential for the liberal society. And if you haven't read it in a while, I encourage you to pick it up again. And I encourage you also to pick up the latest, most recent edition of the book, which has really, if I must say, an exquisite afterword that is worth getting a fresh copy of the book itself. So please join me in welcoming these panelists for what I hope will be a great discussion. So let me dive right in, and I want our focus to begin with, we're going to expand away, but we're going to come back to students, right? Because it's students that we're really focused on here. And I want to ask the question, and anybody can pick it up here, is what's the best way for us to reach students, to help them to understand that freedom of expression on campus is fundamental to the educational experience, even if it's really, really uncomfortable sometimes?
A professor should go first.
You know, the reason I'm hesitating, Emily, is that I find it, once students are in the room, I can make the case. But my problem is there are so many students that are boycotting discussions of this issue, right? And I was recently speaking at a very prestigious liberal arts college that has had some of the problems that you discussed. And A professor said to me, she said it didn't apply to me, but to other speakers that she was urging her students, it didn't yet apply to me, maybe after my book comes out they'll boycott me too, but to other professors whose views were, and we're not talking about alt-right, we're talking about people who are advocating the kind of values that Jonathan has written about and the rest of us up here have advocated. And she said her students say to her, why should I waste my time listening to somebody that I know I'm going to disagree with? So my question is, how do you get them in the room? And I think the best way to do that is to have a discussion. I prefer that to debate because I don't see this as a zero-sum game, where you would get people with different perspectives, probably much more diverse perspectives than we have here, and list various student groups across the ideological and other spectrums to be co-sponsors. And then once you have them in the room, my major contention is for all of those students who are crusading in ways that I so applaud and champion, crusading for social justice and for racial justice and for equality and diversity and inclusivity, too many of them misunderstand that freedom of speech, including for hateful, hated ideas, they see that as the enemy and don't understand that that is their essential ally. And once I get them in the room, I think I can make that case.
If I could just pick up on that, because my comment flows so naturally from yours, Nadine. I'm not a professor, I'm not on campus, I don't play a professor on TV. I do a fair amount of speaking on this issue on campus, and recently conducted an informal, non-scientific survey of a whole bunch of Brookings Institution interns who come out of elite campuses. And I've concluded that we don't know how to reach this group, and that's a problem. That going to campus and hitting the John Stuart Mill libertarian talking points about the marketplace of ideas is just not cutting it with this group, and that they're coming from a different place. They're not worried about traditional stuff like censorship and the government. They're worried about personal safety. They're worried about feeling attacked in their own home. And I don't think we figured out how to talk to them about that. I strongly support the idea that Nadine just mentioned. And in fact, I'm working now with a group called Better Angels to see if we can get some support to actually do a pilot on a university that wants to host it, to get students in a room on both sides of these issues, all sides of these issues, minority rights, speech rights, and so on, and have a structured conversation and see if we can reach at least a few points of breakthrough as a way to begin to learn how to talk about it. Because I think we've gotten pretty good at what I call the supply side level of free speech, which is attacking and knocking down speech codes, embarrassing campuses that do it. Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, for example, is marvelous at that. We're way behind the curve on the demand side, which is the grassroots demand from students for protection. And that, I think, is where we really have some homework to do.
That's a great point. I mean, one of the things that was quite frankly chilling to me when I watched the videos of what happened at Yale and that sort of thing is at one point some of the students were identified. They were freshmen. I mean, that was like a month into their freshman year, and they were already, attacking free speech, or already attacking these sorts of things. Right? Kids are coming to college today already pre-programmed through whether it's bullying, anti-bullying curricula or whatever. But they come into college already predisposed, I think, towards the kind of attitudes that Jonathan, I think, that was very interesting point that you made, right? Which is they've got a predisposition when they come in, and I think it combines with the fact that it's very heady stuff for a college freshman. It is it's very empowering for them, I think, as well. A lot of what they feel like that they're doing, that they're flexing their muscles, and too often we get weak backbones out of university administrators, right, who cave to them rather than standing up to them. And I think that's a dynamic, that empowerment dynamic and a predisposition combined with a sort of, I think what Jonathan is to some extent saying is a sense that is justified by these other feelings that they have, right? Their feelings of safety and that sort of thing. Give them a sense that is a justified sense as well. And I think it's quite a I mean, I think it's a very vexing challenge to think about how we deal with all that as well.
Yeah, I heard your question in an entirely different way. My hesitation was because there's a large question and a small question. Right? The question of how you get them in the room, how you get students in the room, that might be the large question. But I'm a professor. I have students in the room. And the way I thought of it was, what do I do when I'm in front of a class? And students are in the room. We still make the rules. And the rule for the class is anyone can say anything he or she wants as long as you're willing to back it up. The students are different now than they were in our day because they have different cultural assumptions. So that requires some cleverness on our part. When I present what would be sort of interesting civil liberty issues that I dealt with without any kind of, we just went for it. Now you have to be a little clever the way you introduce it. If it has to do with a social justice matter, you just give them the case with the roles reversed. So it's women in the position of authority and men who, you take the assumptions out of it, and you can still get them to look at the principles that are underlying it. So we get to make the rules. We can enforce the fact that everyone gets to say what they want to as long as they're polite. And if we structure the class properly, I mean, the kind of thing we're worried about represents, in my opinion, still a minority of the students that are, it's a different culture, but it's a minority of the students. Most students come to college the way we did. They still think that this is where they're going to discover the world of knowledge. And this is where real learning goes on. They don't know yet. They're freshmen. They think that this is going to be real scholarly study. And they come in serious, at least for the first year. And if you expose them to a good classroom experience, most of them will go for it. That doesn't mean there aren't problems, but it means you can do a lot by having the proper structure in the classroom.
But it's too late by the time, or it's never too late, but it would be so much better if we could start this educational process much, much earlier so they don't come in as first-year college students with those preconceptions. Certainly at the college and graduate school level, when you're having orientation sessions, it would be really important to complement the kinds of diversity education that are going on now in terms of tolerating and respecting and including a range of different people. But how about tolerating, respecting, and including a range of different ideas and make up for the lack of education and information about freedom of speech principles? Start to make up for it in those orientation sessions and acculturate them to that. But preferably that would have started, even back in kindergarten or pre-K.
Purdue is doing what you suggest and getting good results. And I've hit this myself. Most freshmen seem not to have any idea what the First Amendment says. They assume hate speech is not protected by the Constitution.
That's true for a lot of government officials.
Well, it is indeed true for most Americans. I remember in the early 80s, in my first newspaper job in Winston-Salem, the managing editor would point out in no uncertain terms, if you put the First Amendment up to a plebiscite in America today, that being the early 80s, it would lose. But since civics education is no more, I think it would be, if I could think of one thing that is administratively fairly easy and relatively non-controversial, it would be to imitate Mitch Daniels at Purdue and add an hour on the First Amendment to freshman orientation. Because a lot of students apparently respond to that by saying, oh, okay, I didn't know that, which is a start.
If I can say something else about education, Heather Gerken, who's the fairly new dean of Yale Law School, last summer wrote a really interesting op-ed in which she observed that at that point, she said I don't know if that's factually accurate, but she said none of the disruptive events, shouting down speakers, shutting them down, had occurred on a law school campus or supported by law schools. And her theory was that because in law schools, it's inherent in the educational process that of course you've got to contend with a range of ideas and learn to debate against them. and to learn to advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues, as I constantly say to my students. But that's really just critical analysis and thinking that should be part of our educational process all the way through.
So let me play devil's advocate in this vein for a moment. So, Jonathan, in Kindly Inquisitors, you talk about free speech as being a pillar of liberal science, the process by which we sort good ideas from bad ideas, right? In our private lives, we have other people sort good ideas and bad ideas for us all the time, right? Think of, whether you have an auto mechanic or a heart surgeon, we let people sort good ideas from bad ideas for us. And so in a college or university environment, especially where learning and knowledge and conveying of hopefully the right ideas is happening, if there is something that's settled, that's fairly well settled, right? What would be the argument, what's so bad about just saying, look, the Holocaust happened, right? And we know that, so let's move on, right? Look, there aren't intelligence differences across the races. Let's move on. What's so bad about having a college or university saying, no, we're going to put those bad ideas that are really kind of a settled matter aside? How do you make the case?
Well, it depends. First of all, thank you for the plug for the book, which is available for only $12 on Amazon.
Just in time for the holiday season.
And incidentally, this gives me an opportunity to publicly thank some people in this room who made that book happen, including David Bose of the Cato Institute, who put it in print when commercial publishers wouldn't, and Nadine Strossen, who gave it its critical blurb on the back cover, and Kate Shevchenko, who had the brainstorm of doing a 20th anniversary reissue with a new afterwards. So my applause, at least, to people who felt it's nice to have a chance to have those people in one room together. It's never happened before. So it's a question of who we is. If we is the community of intellectuals who decide a question is settled and no longer debated, and that would include, did Auschwitz have gas chambers? What is the speed of sound? Is evolution something that's real? Then they just don't debate it. It's not on the science agenda, right? Science does that all the time. They marginalize stuff like, astrology. Mm-hmm. Lots of people in public, out in the world, would like to debate astrology, or they like to debate Christian Science, and science just ignores it because there's no research job to be done there. If we, on the other hand, means a self-selected group of activists gets to set the agenda for everybody else and use a heckler's veto for those who do want to discuss something, then of course that's an entirely different proposition and profoundly anti-scientific. The message I try to bring to people on campus is, look, if an idea is a really bad idea that's not worth discussing, then the answer is don't discuss it.
Or refute it.
Yeah, or refute it if it's worth your time. But in fact, a lot of what these activists are doing with people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who does not have a single original thought in his head, or interesting thought, as near as I can tell, is give him not only a platform, but make him interesting by challenging him in this very, very brutal way that they do. Imagine if he showed up on campus and there were 10 people in the room and crickets. Then it's a very different kind of world.
And Bernie Sanders had such a great line about Ann Coulter when she was being excluded from Berkeley. He said, "What are you afraid of? Her ideas?"
John?
I was going to say that your question's an interesting question. My answer will sound perverse, but my answer is going to be, it's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? I'm at a private university. I've been writing about private universities. Private universities could publicly say at our school, here's some things that we won't consider. Mm-hmm. Here's some things, the purpose of our school is to do this. We won't talk about other things. They could, and none of them do. Mm-hmm. Every private university, as soon as there's something like this comes up, immediately reaffirms its commitment to freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. So once you make the commitment to freedom of expression, then you're bound by your word. So since they're making the commitment, they've said they're leaving the door open and there are no topics that are out of bounds, and it's the kind of problem that you're posing doesn't come up at most private universities simply because they're not willing to come out and say, anything's out of bounds. They do make the commitment to freedom of
John, I
expression.
think we should explain to the audience, because most people don't know that the Constitution, including the First Amendment, only directly applies to public institutions, including public universities. So private universities are not constitutionally bound, but the vast majority of them choose to honor those principles as a matter of their academic and educational mission.
Or they choose to state those principles.
State those. Touché.
But they do say, I just did research on this. There's about 10 universities that explicitly say, here's some limits on the kind of things that you can do or say. Now, some of them are religious. And will have to do with what you can advocate or what your personal behavior is. At least one of them is not. It's progressive, and it's said explicitly that some things are out of bounds. But almost everyone else makes the commitment. And once the commitment's made, the issues.
Well, I'm not sure. Disinvited speakers seem to happen at private universities as well as public universities, based on my reading of the news. But
They're not officially out of bounds. It's not closed. That may be a problem.
right. Well, I mean, yeah. To your point, Emily, I mean, I think there's an interesting parallel here in terms of the only logic. I mean, the logic behind the argument you make is. One might be that it's just waste of time, which is hard. But the real logic is that there is harm to the world from bad and inaccurate ideas being aired, right? And one of the things I think to me is fascinating about that is that actually has a very long, tradition, which is it goes back to the Inquisition, right? And the logic of the Inquisition is there's no reason to tolerate error in society. Error just keeps people from realizing the truth. Error seduces weak-minded people into doing bad things. And so there's no good reason to tolerate error, right? And I just think that's kind of a fascinating parallel that it goes back to the idea that society is worse off if we tolerate bad ideas. And it's just an interesting historical roots of that idea.
And speaking of history, I'd like to bring Jonathan Rauch back in on this, because so much of your work has been around issues related to marriage equity. And if you wouldn't mind thinking out loud for a moment about the role that free speech, or the lack of free speech, has played in the progress of that social movement.
Well, I don't have to think aloud. This is something I talk on constantly, incessantly on university campuses. I don't know what works with this generation, but I do know what I tell this generation because they don't know it, which is that the reason for the gay rights revolution was not that we had money, not that we had grassroots supporters, not that we had political power, not that we had votes. We had nothing. We had absolutely nothing except our voices. And we only got our voices, people don't know this, because of a 1958 per curiam Supreme Court justice decision, which means there was no opinion. They just issued a one-line statement that overturned the federal government's ability to ban gay publications using the obscenity laws, which is what they had done until that point. We got our voices on that day and used those voices against all odds over a period of decades. And it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work until finally it did work. So I, and the fact that I'm now married to a guy, as I constantly tell students, am living proof that the only really consistent friend of minorities in a majoritarian society is freedom of expression. Without that, we would be nowhere.
And the same thing was true for the abolition movement, for the civil rights movement, for the women's suffrage movement, for the reproductive freedom. Name whatever cause you have. By definition, as Jonathan says, if you don't have majority power, you depend on individual rights and you depend on freedom to voice ideas. Jonathan didn't say this, and it will be shocking to the current generation. Ideas that were hated and were considered dangerous, that were considered a threat, not only to families, but to security. And I mean, all of the harms that are today attributed to hate speech have been attributed to exactly the opposite messages, right?
Yeah.
Pro-civil rights, pro-justice, pro-equality. That was seen as threatening and dangerous in the communities that were being challenged.
If one thing breaks my heart about all of this, it's seeing minorities of all people turn around and make the same mistake of oppressing other people as we were once oppressed. That is such a wrong turn.
So Nadine, talk to me about Charlottesville, right? Because these are great examples. I think the kinds of examples that I do think tap the kind of spirit that a lot of students are bringing to the public square and to their public square on campus about a deep respect for the underlying humanity in every person. That's a powerful energy, and we want to seize that. We want to develop that. And I can imagine what Thanksgiving dinner must be like for you, Nadine, or for all of you. But seriously, Nadine, right? I mean, doesn't your resolve get shaky in favor of free speech when we're talking about white nationalists and defending their right to speak, and when it ends in the kind of horrific violence that we saw in Charlottesville? How do you manage those moments? Right. Besides the fact that pass the gravy, we'll talk politics later. I mean, how do you, when you're in a serious conversation with someone, still have the resolve that you clearly have that says, "Yep, we're going to defend the right of white nationalists to march and to speak"?
You're asking so many complex questions, so I'm not sure I can do justice to the whole welter of them. But most importantly, most fundamentally, and long before Charlottesville, there was Skokie, right? And let me say, I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My father was born in Berlin as what was called a half-Jew in 1922. He opposed the Nazis politically. He was thrown into Buchenwald. He almost died there. I absolutely loathe the Nazis. I hope that goes without saying. And I do have to say this, that if I believed that censorship would obliterate fascism, I probably would be in favor of it, because I think I loathe Nazism even more than I love free speech. But I am absolutely convinced, based on experience in Nazi Germany, based on experience with neo-Nazis and other hate groups in this country, that censorship does more harm than good. I oppose it for principled reasons as well, and I'd love to talk about those. But even putting that aside, assuming that we're forgetting first free speech principles and just talking about strategy, the kind of point that Jonathan made about what do minorities need to advance equality, what are hate groups looking for in terms of retarding it. Not only Milo, but Hitler and his hench people depended on the anti-hate speech laws that existed in Weimar, Germany. Fleming Rosette, who's now affiliated with the Cato Institute, has written about this among other people. And they welcomed those prosecutions precisely because it gave them a platform to get far more attention than they would have gotten and far more sympathy than they would have gotten. So even today, one of the organizations that is best known for opposing hate mongering, the Southern Poverty Law Center, this summer they put out a guide for college students about how to counter the alt-right's recruitment on campuses. And their first message was, above all else, please try to ignore them. Don't try to censor them. Don't try to shut them down. Don't try to shout them down. That is just playing into their strategy. The other point that's raised by Charlottesville is, of course, violence is illegal and has to be opposed. And that was the problem in Nazi Germany. It was not that the Nazis had free speech. It was that they were terrorizing and engaging in violence against their political opponents, against Jews, against other minority groups, without law enforcement. It would have been, the analogy in this country would be as if during the civil rights movement there hadn't been any attempt to enforce the laws against the violence that was meted out, including assassinations. So we need much stronger law enforcement. I haven't read the full report. I've read descriptions of the report that came out on Charlottesville earlier this month that was extremely critical of the failure to protect public safety. And interestingly enough, not critical of the judge's decision to allow the demonstration to go forward.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. Now, Todd, I want to turn to you because I think you would be the exact right person to respond to not the argument that we should never allow Milo to speak on campus, but the person who says, I'm not opposed to free speech on campus. I love free speech on campus. I'm just looking for a balanced approach. So as opposed to the extremist view, right, of protecting free speech, why can't we have a balanced approach which ensures free speech, yes, but also an inclusive learning environment? Free speech, yes, but also civility. How do you respond to what I think people present themselves as offering a kind of just a balanced, reasonable middle? Tell me about how you respond to the reasonable middle sort of argument.
Yeah, one of the things I think's fascinating is, to me, is that, take fire, for example, right, which we've mentioned, is, do you know what it takes to get a green light rating from fire? It basically is your policies abide by are consistent with the First Amendment, right? That's it.
Your stated policies.
Your stated policies, right? And maybe even ideally even your actual policies, right? That's all it requires to have free speech, is just basically follow the rules laid down by the First Amendment, which maybe, as you said, a lot of people might say they're against, but in principle, everybody agrees with the First Amendment. It's very reasonable rules, right? It actually allows you to regulate libel and actual harassment and all these different sorts of things, right? But all it does is it allows you to place reasonable restrictions, so people can't stand outside your window at 2 o'clock in the morning with a bullhorn, right? All these different sorts of rules. That seems to me to be a pretty reasonable policy that works pretty well in society at large, and it does in that sense. It doesn't strike me as a radical policy to say that that you should just abide by the First Amendment. And it's striking, as John said. I saw a poll recently that said only 36% of college students realize that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment, right? Only 36% realize there's no hate speech exception of the First Amendment, right? And so I think sort of the larger picture here, right, is what are we doing? What are we trying to do on these university campuses, right? Isn't the whole point here to create students who are going to be leaders in our free and democratic constitutional republic, right? Aren't these, the kids who go to college are the ones who are supposed to become the ones who become the leaders in American society, whether as politicians or just community leaders, right, and that sort of thing. And it seems like that's one of the problems we have in society today, right? Which is, maybe the optimistic side, your earlier question about how do we reach students, right? I don't think anybody likes the state of public discourse in America today, right? Everybody complains it's too polarized. Everybody hates it, right? And it seems like everybody wants to do, something about it, and maybe helping kids to understand that allowing freedom of speech, just ignoring ideas that bother you, maybe developing a little bit thicker skin about the hypersensitivities and that sort of thing, right? All the things that are the premise of the values that underlie the First Amendment. Let's start it on campus, and then maybe people take that out into society and become a little more grown up in the way we interact with each other around Facebook and the Thanksgiving dinner table in terms of being able to actually talk about ideas that are uncomfortable and the like.
And this is an important cultural argument, and I want to make sure to get John in on the sort of institutional framework, the institutional influencers on this question. And I'm thinking in particular of the 2011 Department of Education Dear Colleague letter, which was intended to provide college and university administrators guidance on navigating Title IX legislation. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, John, on your thinking on the connections between the Dear Colleague letter and the growth of speech codes on campus.
Yeah, thanks, because I'm working on this myself with Georgetown University. And I may be the most optimistic one on the panel because of the work I've been doing at Georgetown and because of my interaction with students. For one thing, I think there's a serious problem with students not being committed to freedom of expression today. You may have the poll that says only 36 know that there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. But that's not actually a big concern to me, because one of my principles as a professor is never forget what I was like when I was a student. And when I went to college, most of the students had no idea what the First Amendment was either. I mean, the level of ignorance of these kind of things probably is not that much greater now than it was before. There is a difference. There's a cultural difference in the sense that we live in a society that's so secure physically that we're at a point at which the next generation is raised where the most important thing for them is their psychic tranquility and their emotional protection, because we don't have to worry about assault and that kind of thing anymore. So they come in with a higher level of expectation for comfort. And that's the way it is. I found it very easy to get the Georgetown University to make a commitment to freedom of expression, because when the issue comes up, most of the faculty are committed to freedom of expression. But everyone on the panel so far has said it's a stated policy, which means there's other things at work. And I don't think there's anything nefarious going on, and there's not a lot of ideological bias. It's something like this. The commitment to freedom of expression has been longstanding. Most of the commitments go back to the 70s or the 80s. Universities committed. And between now and then, the idea of harassment on campus became a more and more important and salient issue. And the Obama administration's policies that you mentioned put universities on notice that they have to be very, very protective. And making students feel comfortable on campus is the way of being protective, and there's nothing wrong with that. We do want students to feel safe, feel welcome, feel comfortable on campus. What people didn't perceive for a long time is that those two things could conflict. The idea of a welcoming campus was designed to just be the university's commitment to having no invidious discrimination. And why would that conflict with a commitment to freedom of expression? But as you get closer and closer to the present, people are saying other people's expression is making us feel uncomfortable. Other people's expression makes us feel unsafe or unwelcome. And now there's a conflict, and the part of the university administration that's designed to protect comfort and safety and welcomeness, they're just pursuing their mission, and they are creating a situation in which complaints can be made based on other people's expression. Universities, such as Georgetown, are becoming aware of the conflict. And when you become aware of the conflict, that's when you have to do something about it. So last year, we made a commitment to freedom of expression. And once we made that commitment, the next thing that we received was permission from the Board of Trustees to make all other university policies consistent with that. Because as long as they're not, you'll have the problem. They're just stated policies. So now we move on to the next stage, which is, well, how can we make the harassment policy consistent with the commitment to freedom of expression? And we're in the process of doing that right now. A big help is that harassment law is limited by the First Amendment. We've got a couple of cases. There's an Alito case from the Sachs case, right, which says expression doesn't constitute harassment. And once we get the law right, the university understands it's not legally liable if it doesn't suppress speech, then we'll have harassment policies in line. This, at Georgetown, just to give you an example, it's not just the harassment policy. We managed to get into the news for all kinds of bad things. We got in the news recently because there's a group on campus called Love Saxa. And this is a group organized because they believe in a monogamous marriage relationship between a man and a woman, and to act in accordance with whatever the Catholic principles are. They got accused of being a hate group because they were committed to monogamous marriage between a man and a woman. Now there was no way they were going to be defunded as a hate group. The problem was that group had to go through a hearing. There was the investigative process. There was the trouble of having to defend what you stand for. And that has a chilling effect. So the next step along the way is we have to make the policy one in which you can't be subject to investigation, or you can't be called in to defend something if the only complaint against you is what you believe or what you say or what you express. And when we get to that point, then all of the university's policy will be consistent with what the stated policies are. It just takes a while. First, you have to get the people to understand the conflict. Then you have to, universities are bureaucracies. It takes a while to move them. But if you're willing to take the time and do the work from the inside, you can get policies right. And the reason is because no university is going to give up the commitment to freedom of expression. You just have to make it a real one.
Right, thanks. I want to turn to the audience for your questions. And we have people circulating with mics. So if you have a mic in your hand, it means that you get to ask your question. So I'll leave it to you guys to recognize people. There we go.
Thanks.
Oh, and I'm sorry, David, could you and everyone else let us know who you are and where you're coming from?
All right. I'm David Bose. I'm from the Cato Institute. I guess I'm sort of following up on something John said, but it's something I keep wondering. We hear lots of anecdotes. How widespread is this problem, which might include how many campuses does it encompass, but also how many students are not simply passively unaware of the First Amendment, but actively hostile to speech? Is it possible, John surveyed elite students at Brookings, is it possible that it's widespread on elite campuses, but not so much on the other 3,000 or whatever campuses? And also, John and Nadine, you were involved in this early PC wars back in 1990. Is this different? Is it worse? Is it more widespread? How big a problem is this really?
Well, I think these are great questions, David, and I've seen a lot of surveys, and the surveys seem to indicate two things. First of all, when I say a lot of surveys, going all the way back, right? I remember, the first one I remember paying attention to was in 1991, because that was the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, and the American Bar Association did this survey of adult Americans. First of all, something like 2/3 didn't even know what the Bill of Rights is, let alone the First Amendment. And then when they were told what it is, more than half of them said, let's get rid of that. And there were all kinds of questions that showed ignorance at best, not just among students, but among the population as a whole, and hostility at worst. So I think this is a chronic problem, but I think it is one that is, then the other piece of it is the surveys that I have read, and there are some inconsistencies, and some of the surveys have been criticized methodologically, so one takes them with a grain of salt. But my overall impression is that now it is a minority of students who are disproportionately outspoken, who want to affirmatively censor ideas they disagree with. The more troubling part of that is that there is probably a majority of students who are passive, who don't care enough, or who think, well, maybe hate speech should be censored, or ideas that we find offensive should be censored. So it's messy, but there is, seeing the glass half full. We have a lot of students and a lot of people in our communities in general who really hunger for discourse, as was said, who hunger for open inquiry. And I think what we have to do is fan those flames, get them to raise their voices and to respond to that tiny but disproportionately effective group of disruptors.
But the anecdotes are great. The anecdotes, they're great because, like Nadine, I believe that there's a small number of students, but who are opposed to freedom of expression, but it's they're a vocal minority. Same with faculty. There's a small number of faculty who are vocally opposed to it. And since they talk all the time, they get a lot of the press. But the anecdotes that come up every time there's another one of these events that happens at another campus, what happens here is everybody says, we don't want that here. We don't want that here. Let's act prophylactically. Let's take some steps now to make sure that we don't have Georgetown in the news the way Evergreen was, or the way Northwestern was with Laura Kipnis. So the anecdotes are what motivate the people who are passive or sort of neutral to take some preventative steps. And you don't need to mobilize a majority. You need to mobilize 1 or 2 faculty members or 1 or 2 student groups who are engaged enough to say, let's make the change. You just, the situation got me mad enough, so I'm changing policy at Georgetown. If you can do it if you try, and the anecdotes are what motivate the apathetic middle to get involved.
So I think what concerns me is that basically the way to think about universities today, by and large, is they're just one big brand, right? We've basically got the rise of the CEO university president, and many, an increasingly small number of them come from academic backgrounds. They're more and more now chosen for their managerial and fundraising experience and that sort of thing. I could tell you when I was on the Dartmouth board, we never had a single discussion about curriculum. In every board meeting, we talked about Dartmouth's brand, right? Mm-hmm. They see it through the lens of a brand, right? These are massive businesses that these universities are running now. And so the problem is, how do they avoid the controversy? Maybe they do what John says, which is that they take steps to put things in place. But I think more commonly what they do is they say, okay, we've got to make sure that we don't somehow let controversial speakers get invited by somebody somewhere. We've got to narrow the range of discussion and take out anybody who's going to cause a ruckus, right? Charles Murray, the word goes out, Charles Murray is not welcome on this campus, and we're going to put in rules that make sure that somehow Charles Murray doesn't accidentally get invited to come speak here at our campus. And I think that's what the concern is, right? And that's what the activists want, right? The activists want to informally narrow the range of ideas and take these ideas out step by step by step, whether by any means that they can, to narrow the range. And that's the difference, I think, with the more formal sort of enforcement-based policies in the 90s, right? The formal speech codes and that sort of thing, which were too easy to challenge, which could be challenged by litigation, all these sorts of things. But if you can just narrow the range of allowable discussion and and just step by step take out the ideas that are controversial, and you can almost always get the administrators to go along with this, right? Is they are concerned about the brand. They don't want to see their name splashed across the front page of the newspaper either.
So that was the second part of David's question. Since he asked both of us veterans, do you want to answer that, Jonathan? The difference
so much.
if any, between
So
now?
much there. First, on the informal point you just made, that's quite right. I was invited to be a speaker on a panel for a free speech national tour launched by a British magazine called Spiked in New York. You were to have been there too.
Oh, I was at another one that got shut down.
Yeah, so that was pulled because I think it was Columbia University said, oops, I don't think we want to do this, and they find administrative reasons. There is one here at AU, similarly.
That's the one I got kicked off.
That was also pulled when the university said, I don't know if it was
They called it hate speech just because we were talking about.
But often what they just say is, you went about the facility in the wrong way, or we can't afford the security or whatever. No. So there's a lot of this squishiness going on, and some of it is based on the fact that they don't want to shell out $50,000 or $100,000 for security. That's another big problem. To the larger question that David raised, a couple points. When I talk to people and do my informal surveys, the biggest problem that I see is not top-down administration censorship. It's bottom-up grassroots chilling. students are reporting to me that although they personally believe in free speech and a majority on campus believes on free speech, no one wants to get in the sights of one of these activist groups, and no one wants to get involved in a classroom conversation where there's a lot of sighing, eyeball rolling, and then there's a campaign on Facebook afterwards. So what they're reporting, 45% or so said that their own educations had personally been affected by these chilling problems and by issues which they were reluctant to discuss on campus. I would then ask them, does it affect your friends? Does it affect people on other campuses? Interestingly, the farther from their own experience, the higher the estimate of the effect. So they said on other campuses, it's 60% of students who are affected. But 40% is a large number of students to be saying, this is personally affecting my educational experience in a negative way. And that's a lot of what's happening. And that's, the peer pressure stuff is a lot harder to reach than the administration stuff.
Is then part of the answer then to, Todd asked for, kind of, grown-up sensibility is part of the grown-up sensibility that we need to inculcate is a kind of moral fortitude amongst those
Some of that
who are
will work.
bringing
I
forth-
don't understand why students at Middlebury weren't suspended or expelled. For example, I think what would help even more is already starting to happen. We're starting to see pushback from especially freshmen at universities, starting groups like Students for Free Expression.
Yes.
It's mostly coming from the younger students who are coming in and saying, hey, I'm paying a lot of money to be here. I'm not going to let some activists decide what I can hear. They're starting to organize the most effective single thing in this is guesswork, conjecture, but I conjecture the most important thing that can happen is counter-organizing by students. Mm-hmm. And these freshmen seem to be much less intimidated by the campus pressure groups than the older students for whatever reason.
I think that the biggest problem is what you've identified. It's the social pressure that comes from other students and the reluctance to say something that will cross the line and make other students react negatively to them. So that's the real problem. And, advocating unpopular positions has never been easy. It's not easy now. It's never been easy. The cost of taking an unpopular position is that you have to deal with the fact that you have this negative social feedback. So what can we do? And someone like a professor, what the university can do is simply provide a background support for the people who are willing to fight the social situation. And what that means is it's not just having a freedom of expression policy. It's like having it be part of the policy that's part of the students' orientation that at our university, no complaint will be entertained that's based simply on a statement of a position. All right? Here I'm trying to use some language from the Supreme Court. Your expression of a scientific, artistic, religious, philosophical, or social position not only is acceptable, but no one can complain that that's a violation of any university policy. And with that background, it's still going to be up to the students to fight the social situation. But the university with that background can be providing support. And that's probably all we can do. And then it's up to individuals to advocate positions they believe in, even if they're unpopular. They have to do it now. People had to do it at the time of the blacklist. Then it was communism. Now it might be capitalism. The ideas are different, but the need to fight social pressure is something we have to take on ourselves. Advocating free speech is never easy. It's not supposed to be easy. Universities can provide support, and if we do that, a lot of good things can happen.
Great, thanks. Next question. Yep, right here. Ed?
Dallas. My name is Gabriel Dallas. I work for the Leadership Institute, and I work with California students and Hawaii students. And in California, we actually have...
California what?
I'm sorry? In Hawaii. So in California, we have the Leonard Law, which essentially applies the First Amendment to public universities and private universities.
And even high schools.
And even high schools. Do you think that in the interest of freedom, this type of law should be applied everywhere, or are we violating private universities, their own right to free speech, if they don't want to follow the First Amendment?
I think that's a great idea, and actually at about the time that the Leonard Law was passed, there was actually a proposal in Congress. This goes back to the 1990s that David alluded to, which was sponsored by Congressman Henry Hyde, whose name might not mean anything to today's generation, but he was a conservative Republican Catholic from Illinois who was best known for something called the Hyde Amendment, which withdrew funding for abortion in government-funded programs. So he was not seen as a liberal, to say the least, and it was one of these man bites dog stories that the ACLU and yours truly individually, I was then president of the ACLU, were strongly advocating this law that Hyde proposed that would have done the same thing at the national level. Now, I have no doubt about it that a major reason, perhaps the major reason why Congressman Hyde and other conservatives supported that was that they saw that the views that were being suppressed on campus were disproportionately conservative views. But I think as a neutral principle, there's absolutely no downside. I should say that there was an option for religious or schools that wanted to stake out a particular identity. There was some exception available for them. But basically for the vast majority of private universities, they would be subject not only to the requirements of First Amendment, but also as interpreted by the Supreme Court, but also, this is important to add, picking up on something that Todd said that's not nearly as well known as it should be, a lot of common sense limits that already exist under the First Amendment. So you cannot directly threaten somebody. You cannot incite violence. You cannot engage in targeted harassment or bullying. And so a lot of the examples of speech that are thrown out as reasons why we should censor hate speech are already punishable, completely consistent with the First Amendment.
So we have a difference in opinion on the panel, because I would be strongly opposed to a law like that. I think that if it's a public university, the First Amendment should govern, and you have to follow the First Amendment, because that's government funding. And that's all taxpayers putting in. In that case, the First Amendment should apply. If you're talking about a private university, private universities can be organized for any reason the organizers want. Most of them are dedicated to the pursuit of truth. Most of them make a commitment to the First Amendment, not the First Amendment, to freedom of expression, because that's the way you learn. But there's no reason why all of them should have to. A university that says, we want to be what Jonathan Haidt calls the coddle you instead of the truth you. You come here, we'll make you feel good, everything will be comfortable. You won't learn that much, but it's okay because everything. If you want to organize a university that way and you are explicit, so people coming in know what they're getting, then you should be allowed to do it. The only commitment, the only thing that universities, private universities, should be held to is if they make a representation, they have to stick to it, otherwise they're acting fraudulently. But I wouldn't support a law that said all universities have to subscribe to the same level of freedom of expression that government universities
I'm sure
do.
you'll still disagree, but I just have to clarify, it's all universities that received a certain amount of federal funding. That was the hook for regulation.
See, there's an interesting thing, though, in this, what's called a private university, right? Which is, so-called private universities have so many tax advantages, for example, right? These huge tax exemptions, right? Now, it's economics 101 that the only reason that we would subsidize something like that is because they're providing some public good to society, right? What is arguably the public? If you're just going there to get skills, to get a better job, there's no reason to give these massive tax subsidies to universities, right? Investment in human capital is a very simple thing. We've had the Strayers and the DeVries of the world forever who could teach you how to be a plumber or a mechanic, or they could, we've got for-profit law schools, right? The only reason we have universities, these massive tax subsidies, is because we believe that they're providing something that's valuable to society that wouldn't otherwise be provided directly. And I think the argument is that they're doing something that enriches society, and in particular prepares people for the duties of citizenship in a free society. And in that sense, I think it's at least worth thinking about the question about whether Coddle U should be entitled to tax benefits if all they're doing is providing benefits to particular students, and we can't say that they're doing anything that provides a public good to society. I think that's the kind of question we should be asking about, a nonprofit university like Harvard with a $25 billion endowment that pays no taxes.
One of the things that I like about John's argument, because I think that you're asking exactly the right questions, but one of the reasons I like the fact that John's argument is out there is that it puts the burden on private institutions to make the case for academic freedom. And it's not just, well, we do it because it's protected speech by the First Amendment. No, now we have to really think about why. Why do we want to have free and open discourse? Well, it now is about making sure that we're aligning with our mission, that we're doing what we say we're doing. We're living up to our promises to our students, prospective students, and the people who help make it possible for them to get there, right? And so that it flips the space, the place where you start the argument, and then you start having to make pedagogical arguments favoring free speech. So it may very well just be another way. I think rhetorically it's valuable to have entities out there that are saying, we don't have to, right? But we're gonna, right? And here's why. And it's a very different set of arguments that they bring forward. So I'm glad that there is pressure to bring these arguments forward.
I'll just add one thing. I see the force of Todd's argument, it's a strong argument. It makes a lot of sense. Nevertheless, I would resist it. And the reason why I would resist it is because the nature of that argument, if it's supported with tax subsidies, it's a public good. That's the kind of argument that can result in everything being subject to regulation as soon as you get some kind of tax subsidy. So I understand the force of the argument. It makes sense. But what I would like to see is that would drive me in the other direction for having a lot less subsidization, but not for more regulation and encroaching on the freedom of the private entities.
Yeah.
And I'm not just concluding that that's the argument, but I think the argument looks something like that.
Right, next question.
A better approach, in my opinion, for what it's worth, I'm with John on this. I would not want to see the federal government use its financial strings to impose uniform standards on private colleges, even if I agree with the standards, and I wouldn't want to see Yeshiva University be required to host Richard Spencer. A better approach, I think, would be something like a tort, making it actionable for a college to advertise that it's the home for free speech and then not actually enforce that on campus and do it through civil litigation that way.
Hello, my name is Eric Peterson. I had a question on Jonathan he hit on, where he said that the thing that got the gay rights movement was free speech, and of course now there's a Supreme Court case about whether or not the government can compel speech. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that case, and if you think that the shoe's on the other foot. That was pretty much it.
Big one, complicated. So this is a reference, I assume, to the Masterpiece cake shop case. The basic facts is gay couple walks into a very high-end bakery that does these really fancy specialized cakes and says, we want a cake for our gay wedding. And the store owner says, on the spot, without any further conversation, we won't help you here. We believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We won't do anything for a gay wedding. Couple files suit. State of Colorado finds with the couple that the bake shop violated discrimination law. Bake shop now sues, saying it has a First Amendment right to refuse this business on the grounds that this would be compelled speech. It's all very complicated. My view is actually very simple, which is that there is no earthly way the Supreme Court is going to be able to set down clear standards that distinguish, okay, what exactly is expression, what isn't? Photography is expression. What about baking a cake? Well, does it have words on it? Then it's expression. Does it not have words? Well, what if it's customized? What about auto styling? What about, cosmetology? That's never going to work. I think the right answer as a policy matter is to do what Justice Kennedy seems to want to do, which is kick this back down to the states, say you're not going to get a constitutional ruling. You guys, go work it out. There's no reason, in my view, that Mississippi and Massachusetts have to have the same policy and strike the same balance between these two contending public goods, so they should do it in different ways in different locations through the political process. That's my policy answer. I'll leave the legal scholars to discuss the legal answers.
No one's jumping in. Next question.
Chris Newman from George Mason Law. I wanted to throw another one of the buzz phrases that's endemic to this conversation out to get some reactions to it, namely the concept of a safe space. Now, this has become sort of a trigger word, or sort of, I think it's become an emblem that's often used by free speech advocates in a purely derisory manner to, oh, these are the snowflakes who want a safe space. I wonder whether maybe what's needed is a more nuanced conversation about, okay, what are the things that as a student you do have a right to be safe from on campus, things like physical intimidation and maybe some forms of personalized abuse. And on the other hand, there may be certain contexts in which, I think the pro-free speech argument can sometimes overreach and make it sound as though it's never legitimate to structure a conversation in such a way where you only want to engage with a limited number of viewpoints. Sometimes we want to have a robust debate with opposing viewpoints. Sometimes we want to work out kinks among people who are basically like-minded, or we want to have people who feel vulnerable for whatever reason and want to not be challenged in certain ways while they're thinking about certain issues. And so I wonder, should we be trying to get rid of the idea of a safe space, or should we be making this a centerpiece of the conversation and having universities talk about what does it mean to be safe, in what context within this institution should you expect to be safe from what exactly?
Great question.
I'd be happy to start, but I first want to say your question was a great one, and the only reason I didn't try to answer it was it's so complicated. I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. And this one, I think you're exactly right, that as with a lot of the criticized phenomena, including, I would put trigger warnings in the same category, that the devil is in the details. And I think it is the worst examples that we would all agree are inconsistent with intellectual freedom, that are the ones that are disproportionately publicized, but that these concepts can be used in ways that actually promote engagement of different individuals and groups with different ideas on campus. So obviously starting with physical safety. We know that for all of the excesses that the pendulum maybe has swung too far, there has been a serious problem of violence on campus, including sexual violence that had not been treated sufficiently seriously. Now maybe we've overcorrected, but that is a basic form of safety that universities owe to all of their students, physical safety against crime. I think where it becomes blurry, and then I should also say, to repeat, certain kinds of expression that directly cause specific, imminent, serious harm, such as targeted harassment or genuine threats, can and should be punished, right? Where it becomes blurry is because it bleeds in, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have no right to be safe from ideas that you disagree with or find offensive. And those are the examples that have been publicized where we'd all say that's a concept of safety that is illegitimate. In fact, it's undermining what we owe students on campus, which is that they must learn how to confront ideas they disagree with strongly and find offensive strongly. Now, the blurry point is what you also alluded to, and where the idea of safe spaces, as I understand it, originated, which is when you have an embattled minority on campus, a group of students that are traditionally underrepresented and still are maybe traditionally excluded and are still underrepresented, and they feel very isolated and alienated. You want to find a place for them to congregate, and that has been racial minorities at a time when gays were deeply in the closet. That might have included a space where they felt comfortable. The one point that I would make, and I think I haven't debated this or discussed it with others, so maybe you can dissuade me, but my starting presumption would be that while one would seek to affirmatively create a positive environment for students in those groups to hang out with each other, I think you could not exclude other students. I think you should not exclude other students. So it should be, an affirmative attempt to create a safe space for certain students who might seek it out, but I think they can't keep others out.
Yeah, to some extent, I mean, so many of these things, it seems so simple, but Jonathan alluded to it earlier, it's like, just don't go to Milo's speech. I mean, it's like, it seems so simple that a lot of these things, right, the sort of farcical safe space examples are, somebody comes to campus and you can't even bear the thought that this person might set foot on your campus and other people might listen to them, right? That strikes me as ridiculous. I mean, it's just like, just don't go to the talk. Go to the gym. Go do your homework, something like that, right? And then you can start getting to some of these, more fine-tuned things that Nadine's talking about. But it seems to me that most of the problems that we have, or the problems we read about at least, are these basic scenarios where somebody comes to campus and you don't have to go. So just let somebody else go. Right? And do something else. I mean, it just seems so obvious and simple to that before you even get to these more, and then we can deal with the nuance questions.
But it's the language. Generally speaking, there's no conflict. Right? People are allowed to speak on campus, and other people don't have to listen. Right? Right. You have the right not to listen. You have the right to make your own safe space. There's generally no conflict, but it's the way you use language. So, John Stuart Mill's harm principle is you can do whatever you want to as long as you don't harm others. So then you just define harm as making me feel bad by what you're saying, and now you can infringe on freedom of speech. So safe spaces, if you use the word safe expansively enough, I feel unsafe if I know that people are on campus saying things I don't like. But that's not a safe space. That's a linguistic manipulation to make a conflict where there really isn't any. That use of the term safe space is illegitimate. Safe spaces on campus are absolutely great. People get together, they make each other feel comfortable. It's great, especially if they're a minority or they need support. Wonderful. It just doesn't go as far as something like you can stop other people from speaking because you're going to call that an attack on your safety.
I agree with that point, that if, as a faculty member, I used to teach on the Holocaust, and I would, when there were images or readings that were particularly, horrific to encounter, I would give my students a heads up. And I didn't call it a trigger warning, but it essentially was that. Here's a heads up, right? This is difficult. And so I have no problem with any faculty member who wants to, kind of codify that in her syllabus. What I would object to is an administrator telling her that she had to. It's a totally different thing. And so similarly, to flip the script a little bit, safe spaces, we all know some of the examples that we would find objectionable. But I read of a CUNY professor. She's a graduate student, but has her own course. She's a feminist scholar who teaches on women and violence. And she uses the language of safe space in her classroom so that she can get men to talk. It's like, if I'm going to be effective as a faculty member talking about women and violence, I have to get men in my courses feeling like they can feel comfortable in asserting their perspective and their opinion. So you bet I talk about safe spaces because it's important to me pedagogically. So to me, I think that goes to your point that do we need a more nuanced discussion? It's not all good or all bad, absolutely. It's how we use it. Sometimes it's just a matter of providing a space of basic respect, and other times it can be very, very intrusive. So we need to make sure that we're clear on what we're talking about.
But Emily, that's so interesting, and thank you. I have to look up that example because you flipped it around from the horrible situation. It made it exactly the opposite, that where it's safe to express any idea, right? No matter how unpopular the idea might be.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. I think we have time for one more question.
I just want to have for the record, though, I think the idea that you go to a room with stuffed animals and coloring books is ludicrous. Whatever safe space is. That just strikes me as absurd.
Hi.
Jerry Curry. I'm a global advisor for the Internet Society. And I guess one of the things that hasn't been brought up, I realize that we're talking about on campus, but the idea that most of the students that are coming on campus are digital natives, and most of them that are coming on campus have created their own safe spaces digitally, right?
Yeah.
So the majority of those entering college over the next 3 or 4 years aggregate their own ideas and debate and discourse amongst like people, and they have been able to, up till this point of entering college, shut out any idea that they chose that either offended them or didn't agree with them, and they could actually curate their own news and information much differently than those of us not of millennial age can do now. And so I think that the goal of universities is really to try to understand this type of student that's coming in nowadays is very different, and it might not be as open because they don't know how to be, because from a digital perspective, they Facebook anybody that's like opinions, they like these things that are similar to their own thoughts, and follow those on Twitter, grab their own news, grab their own information, and the only time that they're actually exposed to information that's not something that they curate on their own is during the hours of school. So I think that there is a big change in the demographic that's coming on from a digital standpoint. And to Jonathan's point, when they disagree with something on campus, and if it's not able, they're going to take it on to social media. And then again, is that now protected under a private or public university once it's online? Just because it's not on a campus physically, it's still on campus online.
Great, Jerry. Anyone want to tackle the digital generation?
I'll just say I recently saw a speech by the president of Chicago, Bob Zimmer. Mm-hmm. And he made, I thought, a fascinating point, which he said, it is human nature for people to, and Jonathan Haidt makes this point very well too, right? It's human nature for people to want to find ideas that agree with them, that affirm what they already believe. It's very difficult to come into conflict with ideas that disagree with you. And so that reinforces that tendency, right? The ability to create these digital communities and that sort of thing that wrap you in a feeling that everybody agrees with you and that sort of thing. And I think the point is his point, which I think adding in the digital part reinforces Zimmer's point, is maybe we need to even put more weight on the scale. Maybe we need to be more aggressive about forcing kids to confront ideas that are uncomfortable to them, because your natural proclivity is to surround yourself with ideas that are similar, and that seems like it reinforces its great point.
And I think the way that you persuade them that is for their own good is, and Jonathan Haidt and his Heterodox Academy have done a lot of this research, is that it's essential for your education and also for life after the university, that you can't function effectively, and it's really essential for your mental health. You're going to become depressed and anxious in the real world if you have not developed the resilience to deal with ideas that you disagree with. And then from a political perspective, because so many of these students wonderfully are engaged with politics and want to be on campus and beyond, you get people like Barack Obama made this a big point, and Van Jones has made this a big point, activists in support of racial justice and other social justice causes saying, you're not going to be effective as somebody who seeks to change society and reform law unless you learn how to engage with those that you disagree with. So I think we have to persuade them that, especially because they haven't had enough of that experience so far. This is a transitional phase to when they're going out into the real world, where they are they can't avoid being confronted with ideas they disagree with. We're going to prepare you to handle that in an effective way, effective for you personally and effective for the social goals that you have.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but I want to thank you for the question, since it's the last question, because it's an interesting question to me, because it's one that I genuinely don't know the answer to. Those are the best questions. And for me, it's, are things different this time as opposed to the past? I went off to college way before there was anything like the internet, and yet I noticed that students are still in their insular little environments, and they only talk, like they come from backgrounds where they all share certain assumptions. It was impossible to have a more insular background than I did. I came from a community in which everyone was Jewish. And I went off to a college where There were other kinds of people there, and they were from different groups. Yet we all came, we were insular then without the internet. Is it different now that they have the ability to form their own groups? Does it make a difference, or is it just a new technology which we still have to overcome and learn about other people through interaction? I think that it only makes a difference if it curtails human interaction and the idea of you being resident at the university or the college and actually going to class and sitting there with other people is what will tend to overcome some of the insularity. But it may be that it was the same for us. We just did it with books or something else instead of with the internet.
And I want to thank our panelists for joining us this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for coming to engage in a conversation which really is at the heart, the foundation of the idea of the university, right? That we want places where there is an opportunity to have a fearless exchange of ideas where we're all groping towards this thing called the truth. And that conversation is something that we're doing at IHS across the country with groups of students, with groups of faculty members, with people who care about higher education, with academic leaders and administrators. These kinds of conversations, I do believe, are core, and it's part of that opportunity that we have right now to re-articulate the importance of open inquiry as the central value of higher education. And that's the central value, I think, that really defines a free society as well. So I want to thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I hope you'll be along the journey with us as we move these conversations forward. And if you will please join me in thanking our 4 panelists for joining us this afternoon.
And thanks to the great moderator and to the wonderful questions.
Thank you.